The conference room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Every eye in the glass-walled skyscraper boardroom was fixed on the moment that froze time. The CEO of Whitestone Holdings, crisp suit, silver hair, towering arrogance, extended his hand to every investor lined up at the polished oak table. Smiles, laughter, firm handshakes, nods of respect. But when his eyes landed on one man, the air changed. A tall black investor, early 40s, sharp charcoal suit, confident stance, carried himself with quiet authority. His name was David King. He had poured his life's work into building a billion-dollar venture fund that empowered overlooked entrepreneurs. He was here as an equal, an invited partner. But when David calmly extended his hand, the CEO's smile dropped. His palm froze midair, then casually slipped into his pocket. The snub wasn't just rejection. It was deliberate, cold, public. Gasps rippled across the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably. A young assistant dropped her pen. But the CEO smirked as if daring David to react. "Gentlemen," the CEO said loudly, skipping over him, "let's continue with the real investors." The words sliced through the air like knives. David's hand was still outstretched, but instead of faltering, he slowly lowered it, locking eyes with the man who thought he was untouchable. His jaw clenched, but his voice never cracked. "Careful," David said in a tone that carried both warning and prophecy. "Deals built on arrogance tend to collapse faster than you think." The room went silent again. The CEO chuckled, dismissive. He thought he had humiliated the man. But what he didn't know, what nobody in that room could see, was that this one act of disrespect had just triggered the unraveling of his empire. And David King? He wasn't walking away empty-handed. He was about to walk away with something far greater than a deal: justice. David King hadn't always worn tailored suits or sat in glass skyscrapers. His journey began far from marble floors and crystal chandeliers. He grew up on the south side of the city, the oldest of 3 siblings, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse. Money was always short, but dignity was never in question. His mother, worn down by exhaustion, would still look him in the eye every night and say, "David, they may underestimate you, but you never underestimate yourself." Those words carved themselves into his bones. By the time he was in college, David had already seen enough doors slammed in his face to know the unspoken rules. Some people didn't care how smart you were, how qualified you were, or how hard you worked. They only saw the color of your skin. Internships? Denied. Venture meetings? Laughed out of the room. But David never begged for a seat at anyone's table. He built his own. Years later, after clawing through rejection and humiliation, he launched King Capital Ventures, a firm that invested in overlooked entrepreneurs who never got a chance. Women, immigrants, black founders, people who had ideas but no connections. Within a decade, King Capital had grown into a billion-dollar force. But success didn't erase scars. Each triumph reminded him of the barriers he'd been forced to break. And every handshake denied him in his early career still burned in memory. So when Whitestone Holdings, one of the most powerful old money investment firms in the country, sent him a private invitation to their exclusive merger talks, David knew it wasn't just business. It was history. This was the kind of meeting black investors were rarely invited to. But inside the boardroom that day, his presence wasn't welcomed. It was resented. And nobody resented it more than Richard Hale, the CEO himself. Richard Hale was born into privilege. The kind of man who grew up with country club memberships before he could tie his shoes. To him, money wasn't earned, it was inherited. For decades, Richard had ruled Whitestone Holdings like royalty. His word was law, his handshake was currency, and his presence in a room was treated like a blessing. Investors groveled for his approval. Competitors feared his cold, calculating stare. But beneath the polished exterior was a man eaten alive by arrogance. Richard wasn't used to people who challenged him. He wasn't used to people who reminded him, silently, powerfully, that his world was changing. And David King did just that. To Richard, the sight of a black investor sitting at his table, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, even a potential competitor, was an insult to his legacy. So when the moment came and David extended his hand, Richard did what men like him always did when threatened. He dismissed. He belittled. He rejected. But what Richard didn't know was that in the modern world, arrogance had consequences. And David wasn't the type to take humiliation lying down. When the meeting adjourned, the room buzzed with polite chatter. Executives avoided David's eyes, pretending not to have witnessed what had just happened. Richard Hale basked in his own smugness, as though the snub was nothing more than another display of his dominance. But David didn't storm out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply straightened his tie, collected his portfolio, and walked out with quiet dignity. That quietness unsettled people more than an outburst would have, because silence carried weight and power. Later that night, inside the penthouse suite of his hotel, David picked up the phone. His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. "Pull the files," he told his assistant. "I want everything on Whitestone's pending acquisitions. Every deal they're trying to close. Every weak spot." Because while Richard Hale thought he had humiliated a man, what he had really done was awaken a strategist. David wasn't just an investor. He was a tactician. And his revenge wouldn't be loud. It would be surgical. The city skyline glowed outside David's hotel window, but his mind was miles ahead. He wasn't just looking at buildings, he was looking at opportunities. Whitestone Holdings wasn't invincible. For all their arrogance, David knew their empire had cracks. And cracks, if pressed at the right angle, could bring down entire walls. By the next morning, King Capital Ventures had mobilized. His analysts dug deep, his lawyers ran the numbers, and his silent partners, those same entrepreneurs he had lifted up when no one else would, were ready to move. And what they uncovered was devastating. Richard Hale had been posturing for months, bragging about a massive merger that would cement Whitestone's dominance for another decade. It wasn't public yet, but inside circles, it was considered a sure thing. Billions were at stake. If Richard pulled it off, his legacy would be untouchable. But if he failed, Whitestone would be left bleeding, vulnerable, and humiliated. David didn't just want to win a deal. He wanted to take this deal. The very one Richard had staked his reputation on. The boardroom was full again 2 weeks later, but this time Richard Hale walked in beaming with confidence. His assistant whispered numbers into his ear, and his investors gathered around, buzzing with anticipation. It was supposed to be a coronation, until the doors opened, and in walked David King. This time he wasn't a guest. He wasn't a hopeful partner. He was the man across the table. Because while Richard had been preening, David had quietly secured the merger's other side. The company Richard thought he was buying, David had gotten there first. He had offered them better terms, respect, and a seat at the table instead of crumbs. When Richard saw him, his face drained of color. "What is he doing here?" Richard hissed. The room went still. David set his briefcase on the table and looked him in the eye. His voice was steady. "Mr. Hale, I believe we'll be discussing terms today. You see, Whitestone isn't acquiring anyone." He paused, letting the words sink in. "King Capital is." The silence that followed was thunderous. Richard Hale's hand gripped the table as if he could crush it under his palm. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the most powerful man in the room. News travels fast in the world of money. By the next morning, every major financial outlet had the same headline splashed across its front page. King Capital outmaneuvers Whitestone in landmark merger. The business world was stunned. Investors who had once flocked to Richard Hale began pulling out. Stock prices tumbled. Confidence eroded. And while Richard scrambled to save face, his board of directors grew restless. The empire he had ruled with an iron fist was slipping away, all because of one decision, the arrogance of refusing a handshake. But David didn't bask in glory. He stayed quiet, professional, letting the results speak for themselves. Because for him, this wasn't just about a deal. It was about justice. It was about showing every young black dreamer who had ever been told they didn't belong in certain rooms that power could shift and dignity could win. Weeks later, in another polished boardroom, David was approached by a group of young entrepreneurs, faces full of hope, nerves, and ambition. They had heard the story. They knew the odds. One of them asked softly, "Mr. King, how did you do it? How did you stand against men like him?" David smiled faintly, his voice low but steady. "You don't win by shouting. You don't win by begging. You win by preparing, by believing in yourself when no one else does. And when the moment comes, you don't flinch." The young man nodded, eyes wide. David leaned back, remembering that day, that room, that cold refusal of a handshake. Then he said the words that would outlive him. "Never let anyone's arrogance define your worth. Because one day, they may need the hand they refused." And so, the same hand Richard Hale once refused to shake became the hand that pulled the rug right from under his empire. David didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need revenge and anger. His dignity, his preparation, and his unwavering belief in his own worth were enough to turn arrogance into ashes. Never let pride or prejudice blind you. Because the person you look down on today may be the very person holding the key to your tomorrow. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost you everything. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever been underestimated, only to later prove everyone wrong? Drop your story in the comments. We love hearing them. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel the power of standing tall in the face of arrogance, hit that subscribe button right now and join us for more powerful, emotional, and inspiring stories of underdogs who rise above. Because here on Racism Exposed, every story is proof that dignity wins.